Thank you, and thanks Bob and Alexandra for organizing this interesting session. It's always a pleasure to be at the ISE and see all my good friends here. I'm going to talk today about an ongoing study. Well, it's actually one that was published last year, but where we're continuing to evaluate different types of exposure models to see how those models predict survival. And I was really fortunate to have such a great group of very smart collaborators, so I want to acknowledge all of their contributions. And our main objective here was to compare the effects of several different exposure models, all of the kinds that you've seen today, on survival in the United States using a very well-characterized cohort, the American Cancer Society Cancer Prevention 2 cohort. And we had really 7 models in about 4 different classes. So we have the hierarchical Bayesian sort of atmospheric chemistry fused to the ground, so similar at a lower resolution than what Ted just presented. A Bayesian maximum entropy model, which just uses ground data solely and geostatistical techniques. A hybrid model, which is similar to what Joel presented, where it's a machine learning approach where we've got a lot of land use, satellite information, and also hierarchy. And then purely remote sensing estimates that ran from about 9.8 kilometers in resolution to about 1 kilometer. So this is what it looks like if we look at the EPA model. We see those well-characterized patterns of higher levels in the Ohio River Valley in California. We see a very similar pattern at a slightly higher resolution with the remote sensing models that Aaron von Dockler and Randall Martin have developed. This is a geostatistical Kriging model. Again, it's picking up a lot of the same patterns, and it's not surprising, right? The data support is always the same here. These are oftentimes models that are using almost identical sets of monitors. And then the final model is a hybrid model where we've done space-time Kriging, and we've included a lot of land use predictors. But interestingly, we really only came up with 2, traffic at 1,000 meters, and green space at 400. So green space is a negative predictor, traffic is positive. But you can see that unlike the other models, we're getting this very fine scale variation. If you look in the bottom panel at Los Angeles, you can see along the major highways. And for anybody who's ever lived there, maybe you've had nightmares of that highway network in your head because it's so congested. But we were able to do that because we assembled over 40 million traffic data points across the country. So these were, very powerful predictors of fine scale variation. Now the health data, it's enrolled in 1982. This is a bigger study than we were able to conduct before, precisely for the same reason Joel talked about, because we had national coverage. So we were able to get out of just those metropolitan areas. And so we increased the sample size by more than 50%. We had follow-up to 2004. And we had about 105,000 deaths, so tremendous amount of statistical power here. And then we controlled for 43 individual variables and 16 ecological variables in a Cox multi-level model that included both zip code influences and county level influences. So this just shows the spatial coverage. And you can sort of see those hatched dots. That's where we previously had done studies. So we've really expanded the area, and that allows us to have much greater exposure gradients, and we're able to see bigger effects. So one of the special things, and it'll be a tribute to Rick Burnett's contributions. Rick and I and Renjin Ma and Ed Hughes and Dan Krusky worked for years to refine this model. And it's essentially a Cox proportional hazards model where we're predicting the hazard function of survival, instantaneous chance of death, so that hazard function, Hij. Then we've got basic stratums, age, sex, race. We have a baseline hazard that's common to all the people in the same stratum. And then we have these A to J terms, so the random effects that are spatially aligned, so we can look at residual patterns of confounding. And I'm going to go a lot more into the guts of this model tomorrow. And then we have a series of risk factors like air pollution and smoking that we put in. So the first thing I want to point out when we look at the results is that if you look in that top right corner for you, you'll see that these are the correlations that we get with models that have ground data versus remote sensing models with no ground data. And you can see, compared to all of the other models where there's some ground data, the correlation really drops off. So there's something very different when we don't include the ground data. And I think this is probably echoing what Ted has talked about. We're getting biased because we're not calibrating correctly to the ground. So does it make a difference in predicting health effects? Absolutely it does. So if we look at this over in your far left, that's the fused EPA model. The Bayesian Kriging model is the next. The largest risks are that model that had the 40 million traffic points and the green space as predictors. Then we start getting into remote sensing that does include, in a fairly crude way, some ground data. And then finally, two models that have no ground data. And you can see the effects are about, in some cases, they're less than a third or even a quarter of what they are for the models that include the ground level data, and particularly the fine scale predictors. And we restricted the analysis to about 450,000 people just to look at central monitors. And what you can see there is that remote sensing doesn't even do as well to predict mortality as a central monitor in the middle of a city. So without that ground data, you're really losing a lot in your health effects predictions. This just shows the overall improvement in the model prediction based on difference in the Akaki information criteria. And you can see here that the top models, we're getting this trend. So as we include more sophisticated ground data, we get better predictions. And with that, we think we're removing measurement error. And if we are, you would expect to see bigger effects. So the risk did vary by exposure model, but those with ground data definitely produced higher risks, and those that had small area variations were definitely predicting a lot more. Now, because we don't really know what the truth is or what model's right, we decided we'd take this another step, so we pooled the estimates of all of those models together and came up with this estimate. It's driven largely by the better predicting models, but it's essentially the likelihood function over the total likelihood function for each model. So if it's not predicting very well, it's not going to get as much weight. But I think this is something we want to think about going forward when we have all these competing exposure models, because it's going to allow us to then say, well, we don't know what the truth is, but our overall effects are very solid when we look at it, and we allow all the models in. So I think ground data appears critical to health effects estimates. And it suggests that we need to predict at the fine scale to give accurate estimates of health effects. And I think the current remote sensing models still lack the spatial resolution that's necessary to address this fine scale variation. Now, do I just have a couple more minutes? Yeah. Okay, good, because I want to shift now into a bit of an advertisement for a project that Joel and Mike Brower and Beata Ritz are involved in with me. It's led by David Diner at the Jet Propulsion Lab. It's a new satellite that's being launched by NASA to produce speciated particle estimates at 1 kilometer resolution all over the globe. So all of these are primary or secondary target locations that are going to have these estimates coming in every 2 to 3 days. We've tried to pick these locations based on the availability of monitoring data, health data, but also to get a real mixture of different types of particle compositions. And you can see from those bottom panels how much it really differs as you go through these various locations across all 5 continents. The instrument itself is going to be spectropolarimetric. It's got a 2-axis gimbal, so it's basically taking shots at multiple angles as it goes around a polar orbit. And it's going to supply something on the order of 200 to 350 kilometer swaths where we get these 1 kilometer estimates at the primary targets at least. And what we're doing now is we're working to develop the atmospheric chemistry models. We're getting the particle monitoring data assembled, and we're working with people to get access to health data that we can use to see how well these speciated predictions will work. But I think, critically here, partly based on what we saw in this study that I've presented, we're never going to try to just use the satellite data. And the products will come out. NASA requires us to put them out just raw. But if you're doing, a health effects assessment, I'd suggest you wait for a year, and it launches in 2021, so the best estimates will be coming in around 2022. So it's going to produce these high-resolution speciated estimates. We're always going to have the ground data. It's going to be fused together with atmospheric chemistry through a Bayesian framework. And we want you to use these data for epidemiological analyses. So if anybody has interest in any of those target areas, or you want to talk to me afterwards or contact me, please do so, because we want to get these estimates being used as widely as possible. So I just want to acknowledge all my funders and point to the paper in case anybody wants. It was published last year in the HP. And most of all, I want to thank you for your time, for being here today.
Many thanks, Mike, for sharing this interesting talk with us. So is there an important question for Mike?